Your brain is being rewritten right now. Not tomorrow. Not when you decide to change. Right now, while you're sitting here, your brain is physically changing, and the habits doing the rewriting aren't the ones you chose. Here's what nobody tells you about the brain. It doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't wait until you're ready to change, until you've decided to improve, until you've finished watching this video and felt sufficiently motivated to do something different. It changes continuously, automatically, in response to whatever you're actually doing. Not what you intend to do, not what you plan to do next week, but what you're doing right now, today, in the ordinary, unremarkable texture of your actual daily life. Napoleon Hill understood something about this long before neuroscience had the language to confirm it. He wrote that the mind is constantly being shaped by the dominant thoughts and habits fed to it. Not occasionally, not when you're paying attention, but always. Always. The question has never been whether your brain is changing. It's whether the change is taking you somewhere you actually want to go. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly which 7 habits are doing the rewriting and what to do about it. There's a moment that happens every single day that most people treat as completely insignificant. The first few minutes after waking up, before the day has assembled its full weight, before the obligations, the notifications, the ambient noise of everything that needs to happen. There's a window, brief, fragile, sometimes only a few minutes long, where the mind is in a state that neuroscientists now recognize as unusually permeable. Not fully awake, not asleep, something in between. In that in-between state, the brain is operating in a mode where its filtering mechanisms, the ones that evaluate, critique, and resist incoming information during full waking consciousness, are still coming online. The critical gatekeeper hasn't fully resumed its post yet. What you introduce into your mind during that window doesn't get processed the way information gets processed later in the day. It gets absorbed. Hill understood this intuitively, which is why virtually every discipline he documented in the men he studied involved some form of deliberate morning practice. Not as a productivity ritual, but as a recognition that the first input of the day carries disproportionate weight in shaping the mental environment that governs everything that follows. Here's what makes this genuinely uncomfortable to sit with honestly. Most people's first input isn't chosen. It's grabbed. The phone, picked up before the eyes have fully adjusted to the light. The news, the notifications, the social feed. A curated stream of information designed by people whose interests are not aligned with yours to trigger the specific emotional responses that keep you engaged and coming back. Fear, outrage, comparison, the low-grade anxiety of a world moving faster than any nervous system was built to process. And that stream, absorbed during the most neurologically permeable window of the entire day, becomes the emotional foundation on which every subsequent thought, decision, and interaction is built. Not because you chose it, because you grabbed it before you were awake enough to choose anything. The brain, which cannot distinguish between deliberately chosen input and reflexively grabbed input, processes both with equal seriousness. It takes whatever arrives first and uses it as the initial calibration for the day, the emotional baseline against which everything that follows gets measured. This is why two people can have objectively similar mornings and experience them as completely different. One person spent the first 10 minutes of consciousness absorbing anxiety-inducing content. The other spent those same 10 minutes in deliberate quiet, or reading something that connected their mind to where they were trying to go rather than everything that was going wrong in the world. By 9 in the morning, those two people are operating from fundamentally different neurological starting points. Same amount of sleep, same coffee, same commute, different brains. Hill wrote extensively about what he called the importance of controlling your mental diet, the specific, daily, deliberate management of what the mind is fed, beginning with the very first input of the day. Not as a luxury for people with uncomplicated lives, as a fundamental practice for anyone serious about directing where their mind is actually going. The surprising thing about this habit, the thing most people never examine about their own morning, is that the content you consume first thing isn't just affecting your mood. It's affecting your perception for the rest of the day. Specifically, what you notice. What registers as an opportunity versus a threat. What your mind is primed to look for in every environment you enter for the next 16 hours. And what the mind is primed to look for is almost always what it finds. Which means the first habit reshaping your brain isn't something dramatic. It's something so ordinary it barely registers as a choice. The first thing you reach for when you open your eyes. Here's something that will probably feel more personal than you expect. Think about the 5 conversations you've had most frequently over the last 30 days. Not the important ones. Not the deliberate ones. The meetings, the planned discussions, the conversations you entered with some awareness of what you wanted to accomplish. The ordinary ones. The ones that happen at the kitchen table, in the car, over lunch, in the group chat that never really goes quiet. The conversations that are so familiar you stopped listening to them years ago. Now ask yourself something Hill would have asked, though he would have phrased it differently. What do those conversations assume? Not what they say, what they assume. The unspoken baseline. The shared understanding of what's realistic, what's possible, what kind of life is available to people in your particular set of circumstances, that lives underneath the actual words and never gets examined because it never gets stated. That unspoken baseline is doing more work on your brain than almost any other single input in your daily life. Here's the neuroscience underneath what Hill observed. The brain is a social organ in a way that goes far deeper than most people appreciate. It doesn't just process social information. It uses social information as one of its primary inputs for calibrating what's normal, what's achievable, and what's worth pursuing versus what should be dismissed as unrealistic. When the conversations you're surrounded by consistently operate from a specific set of assumptions about what's possible, what wealth looks like for people like you, what ambition is appropriate to hold, what constitutes a reasonable expectation for someone in your circumstances, your brain absorbs those assumptions the way it absorbs everything repeated with sufficient frequency and emotional resonance. As fact, not as one perspective among many, as the baseline reality against which your own thoughts and desires get measured. Hill called this the influence of the environment on the subconscious mind, and he was unambiguous about its power. He found that a person could hold genuine desire, genuine intelligence, genuine willingness to work, and still find their results consistently limited by the unexamined assumptions of the conversational environment they inhabited most consistently. Not because anyone was deliberately undermining them. Because the assumptions embedded in familiar conversation are invisible precisely because they're familiar. They don't announce themselves as limitations. They present themselves as common sense, as the reasonable perspective of people who care about you and don't want to see you disappointed. Think about the last time someone in your immediate circle responded to an ambitious idea with something that sounded like concern. Not opposition, concern. The gentle suggestion that you might be getting ahead of yourself. The careful reminder of what happened last time. The loving caution that maybe a more measured approach would be wiser. That response, repeated across enough conversations, across enough years, shapes the neural architecture of what feels possible in a way that no single discouraging moment ever could. Because it's not a single moment. It's the texture of the environment. And the brain, which is continuously calibrating its model of reality based on the inputs it receives most consistently, treats the texture of the conversational environment as reliable data about the actual boundaries of what's available. Hill's solution to this wasn't to eliminate relationships or treat the people around you as obstacles. He was careful about this distinction. It was to become deliberately conscious of the conversational diet, to notice, for the first time, what the familiar conversations are actually assuming, and to introduce, with equal deliberateness, conversations that operate from different assumptions. Not conversations about success in an abstract, aspirational sense, Specific conversations with specific people who treat the desired outcome as genuinely achievable rather than as something requiring cautious management of expectations. That specific quality of conversation, where the desired outcome is the assumed starting point rather than the thing that needs to be defended, changes the calibration of the brain in ways that accumulate quietly and compound significantly. And what it eventually produces in a person's automatic behavior, in the default responses, the instinctive choices, the gut-level sense of what's realistic, is something that looks, from the outside, like a fundamental shift in personality. From the inside, it feels like finally thinking clearly. There's a moment that happens dozens of times a day that almost nobody examines. Something uncomfortable arrives. Not dramatically, not a crisis. Something small. The slight friction of a task that requires more effort than you feel like giving right now. The low-grade resistance that shows up when something important needs to be done, but something easier is available instead. The specific tension of sitting with uncertainty when the mind would prefer resolution. And in that moment, a moment so brief it barely registers as a decision, something happens. You either stay with the discomfort or you move away from it. Most people move away, not through weakness, through a habit so deeply ingrained that it no longer feels like a choice. The phone gets picked up. The task gets postponed. The easier thing gets done first, with the genuine intention of returning to the harder thing later. An intention that the research on human behavior suggests is honored far less often than people believe when they form it. This pattern, the automatic movement away from discomfort toward relief, is one of the most consequential habits reshaping the brain right now, in the lives of most people, without their awareness. Here's why it matters at the level of neuroscience rather than just willpower. The brain learns from what you repeatedly do far more than from what you repeatedly intend. And what most people repeatedly do, across hundreds of small moments every day, is demonstrate to their own nervous system that discomfort is a signal to escape rather than a signal to engage. That demonstration, repeated enough times, builds a neural pathway, a groove, an automatic response that activates before conscious deliberation has a chance to intervene. And once that groove is deep enough, once the movement away from discomfort has been practiced into genuine automaticity, it starts governing behavior in situations that have nothing to do with the original small moments where it was built. The person who has spent years automatically moving away from minor discomfort doesn't just struggle with minor discomfort. They struggle with anything that requires sustained engagement with difficulty. The business idea that never gets started because the first uncomfortable step keeps getting postponed. The skill that never gets developed because the early stages of learning feel too frustrating to push through. The conversation that never happens because the anticipatory discomfort of having it consistently outweighs the actual cost of avoiding it. None of these failures feel like failures in the moment they're happening. They feel like reasonable choices made by a reasonable person navigating a complicated life. But they are the downstream consequences of a habit built in hundreds of small, unnoticed moments. The habit of treating discomfort as a stop sign rather than as information. Hill understood this mechanism before neuroscience had words for it. He wrote about what he called the path of least resistance, not as a metaphor, but as a description of the actual trajectory most minds follow when left without deliberate direction. The path of least resistance isn't laziness. It's the automatic output of a brain that has been trained, through repeated experience, to prioritize immediate comfort over delayed reward. The counterintuitive thing Hill found in the men who built extraordinary lives, and what modern understanding of neuroplasticity confirms, is that the relationship with discomfort isn't fixed. It's a habit, which means it was built, which means it can be rebuilt. Not through dramatic, heroic gestures of willpower, through the same mechanism that built the original pattern, repetition. Specifically, the repeated practice of staying with discomfort for slightly longer than feels natural, in moments small enough that the nervous system doesn't interpret the experience as a threat. Each time you stay with minor discomfort rather than automatically moving away from it, you're building a different groove, a different automatic response, a different default behavior that will eventually govern the larger moments with the same effortlessness that avoidance once governed them. The brain that has learned, through accumulated small experiences, that discomfort is survivable and often productive, that brain navigates difficulty differently than the one that has learned the opposite lesson. Not because it feels less, because what the discomfort means has changed. Before I move to the next habit, and what comes next genuinely surprised me when I first encountered it, because it's something almost everyone does and almost no one recognizes as a habit at all. I want to pause here. If what I'm describing is landing somewhere real in you, if you recognize your own relationship with discomfort in what we've been discussing, write the words wealth mindset in the comments right now. Not as performance, as a declaration that you're willing to examine the habits reshaping your brain and choose, deliberately, which ones stay and which ones get replaced. The people who write those words today are the ones making a different kind of choice than the one they've been making automatically. Write it, and stay with me, because the next habit is one nobody talks about, and it may be the most powerful one on this entire list. There's a conversation happening inside your mind right now that you're not fully aware of. Not the deliberate thinking, the planning, the problem solving, the conscious reasoning you recognize as thought. Something underneath that. A continuous, largely automatic stream of interpretation that runs beneath every experience you have, explaining to you what just happened, what it means, and what it says about you and your life. Psychologists call it explanatory style. Hill called it the dominant mental attitude. Whatever you call it, it may be the single most powerful habit on this list, because it doesn't just respond to your life. It actively constructs your experience of it. Here's what that actually means in practice. Two people have the same experience. A business idea doesn't get the response they hoped for. A relationship goes through a difficult period. A financial plan doesn't produce the results that were expected. The external event is identical. What happens next is completely different, not because the circumstances differ, but because the explanatory style each person applies to the circumstances differs. One person's mind, running its automatic interpretation, produces something like, "This happened because of specific circumstances that can be identified, understood, and addressed. It happened this time. It doesn't have to happen the same way next time." The other person's mind, running a different automatic interpretation, produces something like, "This happened because of something about me." Something fixed. Something that was always going to produce this outcome regardless of what I tried. Because the problem isn't the approach. The problem is the person using it. Same event. Two completely different neurological experiences of that event. And two completely different sets of downstream consequences. Because explanatory style doesn't just affect how you feel about what happened. It affects what you do next. The person who explains setback as specific and circumstantial, as information about what didn't work rather than evidence about who they are, remains capable of action after failure. The failure is processed, the information is extracted, and the forward movement continues, recalibrated but unbroken. The person who explains setback as personal and permanent, as confirmation of something fixed and unfavorable about their own nature, finds forward movement increasingly difficult after failure. Not because the failure was worse, because the explanation of the failure has been encoded as a belief about the self, and beliefs about the self govern behavior in ways that specific circumstantial conclusions never do. Hill observed this distinction across hundreds of documented lives, and he returned to it repeatedly because he found it explained something that had puzzled him. Why two people with nearly identical starting points, nearly identical resources, nearly identical levels of genuine desire and effort could arrive at such dramatically different outcomes. The explanatory style was doing work that nothing visible in the external environment accounted for. It was constructing, from identical raw material, two fundamentally different experiences of reality, and two fundamentally different sets of available options. This is where neuroplasticity becomes genuinely interesting in relation to this habit. The brain, which processes repeated patterns of thought with the same efficiency, it processes repeated patterns of physical behavior, builds neural pathways around explanatory style the way it builds pathways around anything practiced consistently. A pessimistic explanatory style, one that explains negative events as personal, permanent, and pervasive, practiced across thousands of small daily interpretations, builds a neural architecture that makes that interpretation increasingly automatic, increasingly fast, increasingly resistant to alternative explanations, because the pathway for the pessimistic interpretation has been worn so deep that the optimistic one barely registers as an option before the familiar one has already fired. An optimistic explanatory style, one that explains negative events as specific, temporary, and addressable, builds a different architecture entirely. One where the brain's first automatic response to difficulty is to look for what can be understood and changed, rather than for confirmation that something is fundamentally wrong. The surprising thing, the thing that contradicts what most people assume about personality, is that explanatory style is not fixed at birth. It is a habit, built through repetition, maintained through practice, and fully capable of being rebuilt through the same mechanism that built it in the first place. The work of rebuilding it doesn't begin with dramatic positive thinking. It begins with something much smaller and much more specific. Noticing the interpretation before accepting it as fact. In the space between what happened and what you conclude about what happened, there is a moment, brief, easily missed, but genuinely present, where the automatic interpretation can be examined rather than simply believed. That moment is where the habit lives. And what you practice doing in that moment, across hundreds of small daily experiences, is what gradually rebuilds the neural architecture that determines how your brain automatically explains your life to you. Here's a question most people have never thought to ask themselves. What does your mind do when nothing is asking it to do anything? Not the moments of deliberate focus, the work, the tasks, the conversations that require your conscious attention. The other moments, the ones between the demands. The 3 minutes waiting for coffee to brew. The commute on autopilot. The few seconds between putting down one thing and picking up the next. Those moments add up to more of your day than you probably realize. And what happens in them is quietly one of the most consequential things happening in your brain. Because the mind, left without external direction, doesn't go quiet. It goes somewhere, automatically, without being asked, to whatever destination has been worn into it by the accumulated habit of where attention has gone in unstructured moments before. For most people, that destination is one of three places. The past, specifically, the unresolved parts of it. The conversation that ended badly. The decision that's been second-guessed. The version of events that, replayed often enough, has become more real than the actual memory it's based on. The future, specifically, the threatening version of it. The thing that could go wrong. The scenario that probably won't happen but gets rehearsed in vivid detail anyway, as if the rehearsal might somehow prevent it. Or the comparative present. Specifically, the unfavorable version. The automatic measurement of where you are against where someone else appears to be, conducted through the curated highlight reel of other people's lives and evaluated against the unedited reality of your own. None of this is a character flaw. It's the default output of a brain that evolved in an environment where vigilance about threats, past patterns that predicted danger, future scenarios that might require preparation, social comparisons that establish status and safety, was a survival advantage. The problem is that the same vigilance that kept your ancestors alive is quietly consuming the mental resources that would otherwise be available for building the life you actually want. Because here's what's happening neurologically when the mind spends its unstructured moments in the past, the threatening future, or unfavorable comparison. It's practicing, not in a metaphorical sense. In the literal, neurological sense that repeated mental activity builds and reinforces the pathways along which future mental activity automatically flows. Every time your mind drifts to the unresolved past in an unstructured moment, it makes that drift slightly more automatic the next time. Every time it rehearses the threatening future scenario, it makes that rehearsal slightly more reflexive. Every time it conducts the unfavorable comparison, it makes comparison slightly more the default lens through which your current reality gets evaluated. The unstructured moments aren't neutral. They're where the brain's default mode gets built and maintained. Hill wrote about what he called the importance of controlled attention, the deliberate direction of mental focus even in the moments when nothing external is demanding it. He found that the men who built extraordinary things weren't just disciplined in their work. They were disciplined in their idle moments, in what they allowed their minds to return to when the external demands temporarily lifted. Not through suppression, through substitution. The mind that has been given a specific, vivid, emotionally engaging direction to return to in unstructured moments doesn't need to suppress the drift toward the past or the threatening future. It simply has somewhere more compelling to go, a specific desired outcome, held with enough clarity and emotional reality to function as a genuine attractor for the wandering mind. This is what Hill meant by a burning desire operating at the level of daily mental habit, not just as a stated goal reviewed occasionally. The practical implication of this is something worth sitting with honestly. Right now, in the unstructured moments of your ordinary days, the commute, the wait, the space between tasks, where does your mind go automatically? Not where you'd like it to go, where it actually goes when you're not paying attention to where it's going. The answer to that question is a more accurate description of what your brain is currently being built around than anything you've consciously decided or deliberately planned. And it points directly toward what the next habit is doing to your brain. Something so counterintuitive that most people, when they first encounter it, are genuinely reluctant to believe it's actually happening to them. Here's the counterintuitive thing most people never examine about their own thinking. The mind doesn't treat all evidence equally. It never has. It wasn't designed to. And understanding why it doesn't, and what that means for the specific beliefs currently governing your life, is one of the most disorienting and ultimately liberating things you can do with the next few minutes. Here's what's actually happening. The brain, which is fundamentally a prediction machine rather than a neutral information processor, has a specific relationship with evidence that confirms its existing predictions and evidence that contradicts them. Confirming evidence gets processed efficiently, smoothly. It flows through the existing neural architecture the way water flows through an established channel. Quickly, easily, without resistance, because the pathway was already there. Contradicting evidence gets processed differently, not rejected outright, necessarily, but subjected to a level of scrutiny that confirming evidence never faces. Questioned, contextualized, explained away with a thoroughness and creativity that the mind never applies to the evidence that supports what it already believes. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. Hill called it something simpler. He called it the dominant thought pattern protecting itself. And what makes this genuinely important for understanding what's happening in your brain right now is the specific way this asymmetric processing plays out in the context of beliefs about wealth, capability, and what's possible for your life. If your deeper mind carries a belief, installed early, reinforced through repetition, operating below conscious awareness, that a certain level of financial success isn't really available to someone with your particular history and circumstances, then something specific happens every time you encounter evidence that contradicts that belief. Someone with a background similar to yours builds something extraordinary. A strategy you dismissed as too risky produces remarkable results for someone else. An opportunity arrives that, if taken seriously, would require you to update your understanding of what's actually achievable from where you currently stand. And the mind, confronted with this contradicting evidence, does something so automatic and so seamless that you rarely catch it happening. It finds the exception, the specific reason why this particular piece of contradicting evidence doesn't actually apply to your situation. The unique circumstance that explains why it worked for them, but wouldn't work for you. The factor that makes this case different enough that the existing belief doesn't need to be updated to accommodate it. Every single time. Not through dishonesty. Through the automatic operation of a brain doing exactly what it was built to do, protecting its existing model of reality from the computational expense of having to rebuild it every time new information arrives. The problem is that this protection mechanism, enormously useful for maintaining a stable model of physical reality, is actively working against you when the model it's protecting is a belief about limitation rather than a belief about what's genuinely possible. Hill found this pattern operating in virtually every person he encountered who remained stuck despite genuine desire and genuine effort. Not a lack of intelligence, not a lack of access to information. The specific, automatic, largely invisible process of explaining away every piece of evidence that would require the existing belief about limitation to be revised. Noticing this in yourself requires a specific kind of honesty that's genuinely uncomfortable. The next time you encounter evidence that someone has done something you believe isn't possible for you, the next time your mind immediately begins assembling the case for why this particular example is the exception, try something different. Don't assemble the case. Just sit with the evidence for a moment. Let it be real before letting your mind explain it away. Because the habit of allowing contradicting evidence to actually land, of giving it the same quality of attention that confirming evidence receives automatically, is one of the most direct pathways to the neural flexibility that genuine transformation requires. And that flexibility, built through the patient practice of allowing your existing model to be genuinely questioned, is exactly what makes the next habit possible in a way it isn't for a brain that has been trained to protect its current beliefs at all costs. If you've stayed with me until this point in the video, it's because you're committed to creating a life of abundance and success. That's why I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Every video here is designed to help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every single day. This is the habit Hill considered most powerful of all, and it's also the one most people either dismiss as too simple to be significant or misapply in a way that produces the hollow feeling of going through the motions rather than the genuine neural change the practice is actually capable of producing. So before we get to the mechanism, let's clear up the misunderstanding. When Hill wrote about the power of visualization, about the deliberate, repeated, emotionally engaged mental rehearsal of a desired outcome, he wasn't describing a passive, wishful activity. He wasn't describing the casual, cursory mental image most people produce when they try to visualize something for 30 seconds before moving on with their day. He was describing something considerably more demanding and considerably more specific. A mental experience vivid enough, detailed enough, and emotionally real enough that the brain processes it with many of the same mechanisms it uses to process actual lived experience. And here's where the neuroscience catches up to what Hill was observing decades before the tools existed to confirm it. The brain, it turns out, doesn't draw a clean line between vividly imagined experience and actual experience in the way most people assume. When you imagine a physical action in sufficient detail, the specific movements, the specific sensations, the specific environment, the motor cortex activates in patterns that closely resemble the patterns produced by actually performing the action. Musicians who mentally rehearse pieces show measurable neural changes similar to those produced by physical practice. Athletes who vividly imagine their performance produce physiological responses that parallel actual performance. The brain responds to what it vividly experiences, and under the right conditions, vivid imagination qualifies as experience. This is the mechanism underlying what Hill documented across his research, not as mysticism, not as the universe responding to positive thinking, but as the specific, neurological consequence of introducing detailed, emotionally real mental imagery into the brain with sufficient frequency and sufficient vividness that it begins to function as a form of practice. Practice for the neural patterns, the automatic responses, the default behaviors of a person who is already living the outcome being imagined. But here's the distinction that determines whether this habit actually reshapes the brain or simply feels like it does. The vividness and the emotional reality of the imagined experience are everything. A vague, general mental image of being successful or having wealth produces almost nothing neurologically. It's too abstract to activate the specific neural machinery that actual or vividly imagined concrete experience activates. The brain processes it as a thought about a concept. Interesting, perhaps pleasant, but not the kind of input that builds new neural architecture. A specific, sensory, emotionally engaged mental scene. A particular moment in the life being built, experienced from the inside with enough detail that it generates genuine feeling, produces something entirely different. It produces the neurological equivalent of being there. Not completely, not indistinguishably from actual experience, but enough that the brain begins building the specific neural patterns of a person who inhabits that reality. Patterns that eventually start shaping automatic behavior, default responses, and the unconscious decisions that determine the actual direction of a life. Hill found that the men who used this practice most effectively had developed something specific that most people who attempt visualization never develop. The ability to feel the imagined scene rather than simply see it. Not to manufacture emotion artificially. That hollow performance the brain immediately recognizes as inauthentic and discounts accordingly. But to construct the imagined scene with enough sensory and circumstantial detail that genuine emotion arises naturally from the vividness of the experience itself. The specific quality of satisfaction of a problem finally solved. The particular texture of a morning that begins in circumstances genuinely different from the current ones. The felt sense of a conversation happening from a position of genuine capability rather than the constrained position of current limitation. These aren't fantasies when practiced with this quality of engagement. They're rehearsals. Neural rehearsals for the automatic behaviors of a person who already lives in the reality being imagined. And the brain, which cannot fully distinguish between a vividly rehearsed experience and an actually lived one, builds itself accordingly. This is why Hill treated what he called the definite chief aim not as a goal written on paper, but as a living mental presence, something returned to daily, experienced with genuine feeling, held with enough consistent attention that it began to function less like an aspiration and more like a memory of something real. Because the brain that has rehearsed something vividly enough eventually stops experiencing it as future possibility. It starts experiencing it as familiar territory. And familiar territory, for the brain, is where automatic behavior lives. We've covered all 7 habits now. The first input of the morning, the conversations you keep having, what you do with discomfort, how you explain things to yourself, where your attention goes in unstructured moments, how you treat contradicting evidence, what you repeatedly imagine in detail. 7 habits. 7 ways the brain is being continuously reshaped right now, without your awareness, in directions determined not by your conscious intentions, but by the accumulated patterns of your ordinary daily behavior. And if you've been paying close attention, you may have noticed something. These 7 habits aren't actually 7 separate things. They're 7 expressions of the same underlying mechanism. Hill understood this, though he approached it from a different angle than modern neuroscience does. He wrote about what he called the law of habit, the principle that the mind moves, automatically and without effort, along the pathways most frequently traveled. That whatever is practiced consistently, whether deliberately or accidentally, whether chosen or absorbed, eventually becomes the default output of the system doing the practicing. The 7 habits we've discussed are all, at their core, about the same thing. What gets practiced most consistently in the ordinary, unremarkable, largely unexamined texture of a daily life. And here's what makes this observation more than just an interesting pattern. It's the most practical thing in this entire video. Because once you see that these 7 habits share the same underlying mechanism, repetition producing automaticity, producing the default behavior that governs the actual direction of your life, something becomes clear that isn't clear when each habit is treated in isolation. You don't have to change everything at once. You don't have to overhaul your morning, your conversations, your relationship with discomfort, your explanatory style, your idle attention, your processing of contradicting evidence, and your visualization practice simultaneously. Because they're not 7 separate systems requiring 7 separate interventions. There's 7 points of access to the same system. Which means that genuine change at any one of these points creates conditions that make change at the others more possible, not through willpower applied simultaneously across all 7, but through the compounding effect of a system that is beginning, at any entry point, to move in a different direction. Hill observed this compounding effect consistently in the men he studied. The transformation rarely began everywhere at once. It began somewhere specific, often somewhere small, somewhere that seemed almost too modest to account for the magnitude of change that eventually followed. A different morning practice. A single new conversation that operated from different assumptions. A small, consistent change in how discomfort was handled. And then, over time, without the person necessarily planning for it, or even fully noticing it while it was happening, the change at that one point began producing conditions that made change at adjacent points more natural. Not because of some mystical interconnectedness between the habits. Because the brain that is building new pathways in one domain is simultaneously becoming more neurologically flexible overall, more capable of building new pathways in other domains, because the experience of successfully changing one automatic pattern has updated the brain's own model of its capacity for change. This is something Hill captured in principle long before neuroscience had the language for it. He wrote about the importance of beginning. Not perfectly, not with a complete plan for transforming every dimension of your mental life simultaneously, but beginning at the most accessible point, with the most available change, and trusting that the mechanism of repetition producing automaticity would do the rest, given sufficient consistency and sufficient time. The counterintuitive thing he found, and what modern understanding of neuroplasticity confirms, is that the size of the initial change matters far less than the consistency of it. A small change practiced with genuine consistency produces more lasting neural change than a large change practiced with intermittent intensity. Because the brain responds to repetition, not to magnitude. And repetition, applied consistently to any of the 7 points of access we've discussed, sets the same mechanism in motion. The mechanism that built the current patterns in the first place, now pointed in a direction that was chosen rather than absorbed. But here's what Hill found most worth documenting about this mechanism. Something about what happens at a specific point in the process that almost nobody anticipates, and that determines whether the change ultimately holds or quietly reverses itself when the conditions that made it feel easy temporarily disappear. There's a specific moment in the process of genuine neural change that Hill documented with unusual care. Not the beginning. The beginning is often the easiest part, carried by the energy of a new decision, the clarity of fresh understanding, the specific quality of motivation that arrives when something finally makes sense in a way it didn't before. Not the end. The end takes care of itself once the new patterns have been practiced into genuine automaticity. The moment Hill kept returning to was the middle. Specifically, a particular phase of the middle that he found ended more genuine attempts at transformation than any external obstacle ever did. He described it as the period of apparent stagnation. Here's what it actually looks like from the inside, so you can recognize it if you're currently in it or when you enter it. You've begun. The new practice is real, not perfect, not effortless, but genuinely happening. The morning is being managed differently. The conversations are shifting, even slightly. The discomfort is being stayed with more consistently. The explanatory style is being examined rather than automatically accepted. The idle attention is being redirected. The contradicting evidence is being allowed to land. The visualization is being practiced with genuine engagement. Something is happening. You can feel it, even if you can't yet see it in your external results. And then, at some point, usually somewhere between 3 weeks and 3 months into the genuine practice, the feeling changes. The clarity that accompanied the beginning has faded into ordinary routine. The motivation that felt so accessible at the start requires more deliberate effort to access. The external results, which you may have unconsciously expected to arrive faster than they have, are still largely reflecting the old patterns rather than the new ones. And the brain, which has been doing real work, building real pathways, genuinely changing in ways that don't yet show up in external evidence, produces an experience that feels, from the inside, almost indistinguishable from nothing happening. This is the apparent stagnation, not actual stagnation. Apparent stagnation. The change is continuing. The pathways are being built. The new patterns are being practiced into progressively deeper grooves that will eventually produce the automatic behavior that makes the whole thing feel effortless. But none of that is visible yet. What's visible is the ordinary Tuesday that feels exactly like the ordinary Tuesday 3 months ago, except that 3 months of genuine effort have been invested and the external environment is still largely reflecting the old reality rather than the new one being built. Hill found that this period, this specific, predictable, almost universal phase of apparent stagnation, was where most genuine attempts at transformation ended. Not through a dramatic decision to quit, through the gradual erosion of commitment that happens when sustained effort stops producing the confirmatory feedback that motivated the effort in the first place. The person who understood what was actually happening during apparent stagnation, who knew that the absence of visible external change was not evidence that internal change had stopped, navigated this period with dramatically different results than the person who interpreted the stagnation as a signal that the approach wasn't working. Because the interpretation of the stagnation determines the response to it. And the response to it determines whether the neural change that was genuinely happening gets enough time to cross the threshold into something visible and self-reinforcing, or gets abandoned just before it would have produced the external confirmation that would have made continuing feel justified. Hill watched this timing play out with a consistency he found genuinely difficult to overstate. The people who quit during apparent stagnation almost always quit just before the external environment would have started reflecting the internal change. Not because they were weak, because they didn't know what the apparent stagnation actually was. They interpreted absence of visible confirmation as evidence of failure. And evidence of failure, interpreted as such, rationally justifies stopping. But if the absence of visible confirmation is actually the normal texture of the phase immediately preceding visible change, if apparent stagnation is not a signal that nothing is working but rather a predictable feature of the process that works, then the rational response is completely different. You stay, not with gritted teeth determination, with the specific quality of patient, informed continuation that belongs to someone who understands what phase they're in and what it actually means. Hill found that this understanding, held not as abstract knowledge but as lived, practically applied orientation, was worth more during the apparent stagnation phase than any increase in effort or intensity of practice. Because effort applied without understanding produces anxiety. Effort applied with understanding produces something the anxious version never can: patience with the process. And patience with the process, maintained through the apparent stagnation, is what allows the change that was genuinely happening all along to finally, inevitably, cross the threshold into something you can actually see. Hill spent the final years of his research asking a question he hadn't thought to ask in the beginning. Not what did these men build? Not what strategies did they use, or what principles did they apply, or what external circumstances contributed to their success. He started asking what it felt like, from the inside. Once the work had been done, the patterns rebuilt, the neural architecture genuinely updated through the patient, repetitive, largely invisible process we've been discussing throughout this video. What was the actual lived experience of a mind that had been genuinely reshaped? The answers he received were remarkably consistent across men who were otherwise quite different in personality, industry, and external circumstance. And the consistency pointed towards something that most people, when they imagine success, don't actually imagine. They imagine relief. The specific exhale of someone who has finally arrived somewhere after a long and difficult journey. The satisfaction of external results finally matching internal desire. The specific pleasure of proving something, to themselves, to the people who doubted them, to the earlier version of themselves who wasn't sure this was actually possible. Those things were real, and Hill documented them. But underneath all of them, and more durable than any of them, was something quieter, a different relationship with their own minds. Specifically, the experience of a mind that was finally, consistently, working in the same direction as their conscious intentions rather than in quiet opposition to them. Most people have never experienced this. Not because they're incapable of it, because the specific quality of internal alignment that produces it requires the kind of deliberate, sustained, patient work with the 7 habits we've discussed, and most people never do that work consistently enough for long enough to reach it. But it's worth describing what it actually feels like. Because understanding what's on the other side of apparent stagnation is precisely the kind of information that makes staying through the apparent stagnation possible. It feels like thinking clearly for the first time, not more clearly than before. Clearly in a way that reveals, in retrospect, that what felt like clear thinking before was actually thinking conducted through significant interference, the constant, low-grade friction of a mind running patterns that worked against its own stated intentions. When that friction is genuinely reduced, when the automatic morning response, the conversational assumptions, the relationship with discomfort, the explanatory style, the idle attention, the processing of contradicting evidence, and the quality of mental rehearsal have all been rebuilt around patterns that serve the desired direction rather than contradict it. The experience of daily thinking changes in a way that's difficult to communicate to someone who hasn't felt it. Decisions that previously required sustained internal negotiation start happening with a quality of natural ease. Not because the decisions have become easier in any objective sense. Because the part of the mind that was previously arguing against the aligned choice has been gradually, through patient repetition, rebuilt into something that argues for it instead. Opportunities that were previously invisible start becoming visible. Not because more opportunities exist, because the brain's filtering system, now calibrated by different habits to look for different things, has been recalibrated toward what's actually available rather than toward confirmation of what isn't. And the experience of difficulty, the inevitable friction of building something real in a world that doesn't automatically cooperate, changes in quality rather than quantity. The difficulty doesn't decrease, but what it means changes. For a mind that has spent years practicing the automatic movement away from discomfort, difficulty feels like a threat, a signal that something is wrong, a reason to reconsider the direction. For a mind that has spent months consistently practicing the habit of staying with discomfort rather than automatically escaping it, difficulty feels like something else, like the normal texture of doing something that matters. Not pleasant, necessarily, but not threatening, not a reason to stop. Simply the expected resistance of a world that requires genuine engagement rather than passive observation. Hill found that this shift in the meaning of difficulty, from threat to terrain, was one of the most practically significant changes the rebuilt mind produced. because it made the full range of possible endeavor available in a way it simply isn't for a mind that experiences difficulty primarily as a signal to withdraw. And what becomes possible for a mind that can engage with the full range of difficulty without interpreting it as evidence of fundamental inadequacy is considerably more than what was possible before the work began. Not because the external world has changed, because the internal world doing the perceiving has. And that internal change, built through the unglamorous repetition of 7 ordinary habits practiced with unusual intentionality, produces something that accumulates quietly and arrives, eventually, with a force that seems disproportionate to the modesty of its origins. Which brings us, finally, to the question that the entire video has been building toward, the one that only makes complete sense now that we've covered all of this. Not what do you need to change, but what do you need to understand about what's already changing right now without your awareness, and what that understanding makes possible that wasn't possible before you had it. Let's go back to where we started. Your brain is being rewritten right now, not tomorrow, not when you decide to change. Right now, while you've been listening, your brain has been physically changing, and the habits doing the rewriting are either the ones you chose or the ones that were chosen for you by default. That's where we began. And everything we've covered since then has been moving toward a single understanding that is more practical, more immediately applicable, and more genuinely transformative than any specific technique or strategy we could have discussed. The understanding that the brain doesn't change through dramatic decisions made in peak moments of motivation. It changes through what happens in the ordinary moments that surround those peaks, the unglamorous, unremarkable, largely unwitnessed texture of daily habit that continues long after the peak moment has faded and the motivation that accompanied it has returned to its baseline. Hill knew this, not as a theory, as an observation made across hundreds of documented lives, each one confirming the same underlying principle from a different angle. The mind is always being shaped. Always. By something. The only question that was ever worth asking is whether the something doing the shaping was chosen deliberately or absorbed by default. And what this video has given you, if it has landed somewhere real rather than simply passing through as interesting information, is the specific awareness that makes choosing possible in a way it isn't when the shaping is happening without your knowledge. Because you can't choose what you can't see. And you couldn't fully see these 7 habits before you understood what they were actually doing. The first input of the morning. You now know that those first permeable minutes are doing neurological work that no other part of the day replicates. The conversations you keep having. You now know that the assumptions embedded in familiar conversation are being absorbed as baseline reality by a brain that doesn't distinguish between chosen belief and absorbed one. What you do with discomfort. You now know that every small movement away from minor friction is building the automatic response that will govern your behavior in the moments that actually matter. How you explain things to yourself. You now know that explanatory style is a habit with neural architecture, not a fixed personality trait. Where your attention goes in unstructured moments. You now know that the idle mind isn't resting, it's practicing. How you treat contradicting evidence. You now know that the automatic dismissal of evidence that challenges existing belief is a feature of the system, not a conscious choice, and that it can be interrupted. What you repeatedly imagine in detail. You now know that vivid mental rehearsal is neurologically closer to actual experience than most people ever realize, and that the brain builds itself accordingly. 7 habits. 7 points of access to the same underlying system. And the system, once understood, is no longer invisible, which changes everything about your relationship with it. Not because understanding produces change by itself, we covered that. Understanding alone rarely changes behavior at the level where behavior is actually governed, but because understanding changes what you notice, and what you notice determines what you can choose. And what you consistently choose, across the ordinary moments that make up the actual substance of a life, is what the brain builds itself around. Hill spent 20 years documenting why some people's brains built themselves into instruments capable of extraordinary things while others, with equal raw material, built themselves into instruments that kept producing the same limited results regardless of how much conscious effort was applied to changing them. His answer wasn't complicated. The first group was, mostly without realizing it, practicing different habits in the ordinary moments. Not dramatically different, not heroically different. Different in the specific, small, consistent ways that the mechanism of neuroplasticity rewards with compounding change over time. The second group wasn't practicing worse habits out of weakness or laziness or insufficient desire. They were practicing them without knowing that's what they were doing. Without knowing that the ordinary moment was where the brain was being built. Without knowing that the first thing grabbed in the morning, the assumptions embedded in the familiar conversation, the automatic movement away from minor discomfort, the self-explanation applied to the small setback, the destination of the wandering mind, the dismissal of the contradicting evidence, the vagueness of the imagined future, without knowing that all of these unremarkable things were, together and continuously, writing the neural code that determined what their lives would produce. You know now. And the knowing, held not as interesting information but as lived orientation, as a genuine shift in how you experience the ordinary moments that you're about to return to, is the beginning of something that no dramatic decision, no peak motivation, no single moment of inspiration ever reliably produces. A different brain, built from the same ordinary days, one habit at a time. If this video gave you something real, something that changed how you see the ordinary moments waiting for you after you close this, follow the channel and share it with 5 people whose brains are being reshaped right now without their knowledge. Every video here exists for one reason: to make the invisible visible, so that what's already changing can finally change in a direction you actually chose.